It's my great pleasure to introduce Kaitlyn, who will begin this morning.
Good morning. My name is Kaitlyn Hodgman, and I'm a senior member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium on the future of the Middle East and North Africa. The Dr. John Mayer Global Citizenship Award was established by the Institute for Global Leadership in 1993 to honor the life and work of world-renowned nutritionist John Mayer, who epitomized dedication to public service. This award is presented annually at the EPIIC Symposium to recognize distinguished scholars and practitioners dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. Ambassador Nicholas Burns dedicated 27 years of his life to diplomacy. He is a career Foreign Service officer who has served as ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Greece, and as the State Department spokesman before serving as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008. Earlier in his career, he served on the National Security Council staff, where he was Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia Affairs, and Special Assistant to President Clinton, and before that, Director of Soviet Affairs for President George H.W. Bush. He also worked at the American Consulate General in Jerusalem and in the American embassies in Egypt and Mauritania. Since leaving the Foreign Service in 2008, Ambassador Burns has been the professor of the practice of diplomacy and international politics at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he is the faculty chair of the school's programs on the Middle East, India, and South Asia, and is director of the Future of Diplomacy project. He writes a bi-weekly foreign affairs column for the Boston Globe and is director of the Aspen Strategy Group and senior counselor at the Cohen Group. On behalf of the IGL and the EPIIC class of 2014, I'm honored to bestow the Dr. John Mayer Global Citizenship Award to Ambassador Burns in recognition of your distinguished career confronting the world's most pressing challenges through skilled negotiation and diplomacy.
Kaitlyn, thank you very, very much. I'm really honored by the John Mayer Award. I'm old enough, I grew up here outside of Boston in Wellesley, Mass. To have remembered him when he was president of Tufts and what an inspiring figure he was. He was an internationalist. He was a nutritionist. He was someone who was ahead of his time in looking at the big transnational issues that your generation, the generation of the students here, face. And he's someone that we can all emulate, so I'm very, very honored to be here. And I want to thank the organizers of the Institute for inviting me. I'm sorry I missed yesterday. I would have liked to have seen my friend Robert Ford, who I guess was just one day removed from the State Department before he came here to Tufts. I was stuck in a snowstorm in Colorado, barely made it back, but I'm really happy to be here. I know we don't have a lot of time this morning, so what I've been asked to do is say a few words about the United States of America, our policy towards the Middle East revolutions, the Arab revolutions. I want to do that in a brisk way, hopefully not too simplistic, because I don't want to belabor the points. I'd rather get to a discussion. I know there are a lot of people here who have their own views. We have people from the Arab world. We should hear from them. And I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of this. And I also thought I should say a word about Ukraine, because it's so present as the major international crisis this weekend. So with that, let me just say one way to think about this subject, I know you've been discussing it and debating it for the last 6 days, is just to remember the contrast between March 2nd of 2011 and March 2nd of 2014. Many people who are here, many of the students perhaps were in the Arab world. A lot of us back here watching the events in the Arab world. And there wasn't a human being, a living, breathing human being with a heart and an historical memory who wasn't inspired by what happened in January of 2011, in February and March of 2011, in places like Tahrir Square, in Tunisia, in Libya, across the Arab world, from North Africa to the Levant to the Gulf, even to places like Bahrain. And to see so many young people, especially, asserting their democratic rights, asserting the right to a better life, to opportunity, to education, and to self-rule was inspiring. And And I thought that our country and our President Barack Obama reacted in the most complex situation that I can imagine for an American president in a very effective way. As I saw the president, he had to make the following calculation. Where can the United States support reform and where can we support democracy? But where also must we support our ongoing security interests? And in a way, and I told this to my students over at the Kennedy School, and by the way, I've always had students from Fletcher School in my class at the Kennedy School, and they've always been brilliant. And one of them is here, Tori Tausig. She's here. She's a second-year student at Fletcher who has come over to the Kennedy School to take our courses. I saw President Obama with the following dilemma. He was up in a high wire with the spotlight of international attention on it and no net below him. And he was trying to juggle two competing American interests. On the one hand is the historic American interest that goes back to our founding, to our Constitution, to the Bill of Rights, and to the great tradition in our foreign policy that we ought to try to support people beyond our shores who want to struggle for freedom and democracy. And President Obama made that choice when he disavowed President Mubarak as of January 25th, 26th of 2011. He made that choice when he supported the revolution in Libya, both then and subsequently. And he certainly made that choice when he supported the Tunisian revolution as well. So on the one hand, he was trying to uphold what is the essence of American foreign policy, and that is the democratic rule worldwide, the democratic aspiration worldwide. On the other hand, the United States, as a global power, has a history in the Middle East. A history of being involved as a player, politically, militarily, economically, security interests. I think the dilemma for President Obama, he wanted to support democracy where he could and reform. He also needed, I think in his own mind, to support security interests of the United States on the other. And it was difficult to balance those two. Because while we supported the young people in Tahrir Square, we didn't support the people in Pearl Square because of our security interests in the Gulf, because of the need for the United States to see energy flow, not so much to us because we're largely independent of Middle East energy now, but to our allies in Europe, to our allies Japan and South Korea and Asia, to the Chinese. And it wasn't just energy, although that was a big part of it, I think. It was also the fact that the Gulf countries have been historically a buffer, if you will, against Iran. And certainly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, to a lesser extent perhaps Oman in this equation, had seen their relationship with the United States as containing the spread of Iranian power in the Middle East. And so while some people might have seen, some people charged that the United States was acting in a hypocritical way, I thought maybe I'm sympathetic to President Obama, first of all. I respect him, secondly. And third, since I've served in government, I have a real appreciation for the complexity of what it's like to make these decisions. It was difficult to balance our interests. I thought the President did it as best as he possibly could have in that scenario. It was a hopeful time for the Arab peoples. It was a hopeful time for Americans, Europeans, Asians who support the Arab world and want to see reform in the Arab world. A hopeful time. And just keep that image as you think about our time now, about March 2nd of 2014, because we're really looking at a burning Middle East. And there's really no other way to put it. Of the 22 Arab countries, all of them have experienced the drama, the difficult choices of these reform revolutions. And with the possible exception of Morocco and Tunisia, very few of them are better off now in terms of stability than they were 3 years ago, and that's a great shame. The King of Morocco has made some very wise, intelligent decisions about devolving some of his power to constitutional authorities. I think in Tunisia, while there have been many problems, I think the government there, the Islamist parties that are involved in the government, have acted in a relatively responsible, balanced way, and the Tunisians are working through the sharing of power. But it's hard to find a hopeful story in the rest of the Arab world, and if I'm missing something, I hope one of the students or some of the people from the Arab world will point that out. But think of what's happened in Egypt, where we're right back to an authoritarian military government. That's where the protests have started in the middle part of January of 2011. Back to a situation where the largest political party in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm not particularly appreciative of the policies of that party, but they were constituted in a democratic way. They did run in elections. Their candidate did win. That party's now outlawed. And the people who belong to the party, not just the leaders, are being branded in some corners of Egypt by the government officials as terrorists. It doesn't seem to be a very smart thing to do if you're trying to unite your country and not divide your country. The economy has imploded in Egypt. There is very little chance of reform politically. And unfortunately, I see a rather large chance of continued division and unfortunately violence in Egypt, because the lines have been drawn in the most dramatic and difficult way. And you do have to ask in Egypt, what is the policy of the United States? Is it just to get along, or is it to use our influence as best we can to encourage the military leaders not just to do the kind of things that we would want them to do on the security side, which is to keep Sinai peaceful and to maintain a moderate stance towards Israel and to accept the state of Israel and to accept the peace agreement from the Camp David Accords of '79, but also we have to be concerned with what that government does in its own country. And if there's going to be further instability and violence, that's not going to serve anyone's interest. It would seem to me a more open, a slightly more aggressive, slightly more public nudging and encouragement of the American government to the Egyptian authorities to do what they can to keep that political system liberal, to return to democratic rule, and to return to elections in the future. That's free and fair elections. That's very important. Further, into the Levant, and I know Ambassador Ford was here yesterday, and I wish I could have heard him speak. Syria is an utter catastrophe. To think that a country of 22.4 million people, 9.3 million of them are refugees. So they've lost their homes, they've lost their jobs, they're on the run. If they haven't fled to Jordan or to Iraq or to Lebanon, they're refugees in their own country. There's not another country in the world where as high a percentage of the population is refugee, is living without any possible means of support, at the mercy of international relief organizations and the great work that NGOs are doing, but also victims, both of the government of President Assad, which is firing barrel bombs into crowded civilian neighborhoods, and victims of some of the jihadi groups as well, who have been vicious towards the civilians. And to see that essentially the international community believes it can do nothing. The abject failure of the Geneva I and Geneva II negotiations. The outright cynicism and refusal of the Russian government and the Chinese government to do the right thing and to allow United Nations-sponsored humanitarian convoys into the besieged cities of Homs and Aleppo. And the willingness of China, and especially Russia, to use their veto in the Security Council, just on this humanitarian issue, not to allow people to get the kind of food assistance, medical assistance, emergency housing assistance that they need to stay alive in the winter in that country. And frankly, to see the fact that the United States doesn't have a lot of answers either. And we probably stayed too long at the table with the Russians, who've given us absolutely nothing on the Syria question. And you have to wonder when the international community is going to reach its Srebrenica moment in Syria. A lot of you will remember, if you're too young, you might study the Bosnian War that went on for nearly 4 years before the international community stepped in to stop it. And during those 4 years, several 100,000 people were killed, 2.5 million people made homeless, and the most sordid, evil, dramatic event of the war was the Bosnian Serb military assault on the Muslim enclave, United Nations protected enclave of Srebrenica, July 10, 11, 12 of 1995. And when General Ratko Mladic entered the city, he went right through the Dutch UN peacekeepers, who did not use force to stop him. Mladic separated the men and boys from the women and girls, and he murdered 8,000 Muslim men and boys in 3 days. He shot them to death. And it was the worst war crime in Europe since the Nazis. And the world did nothing to prevent it. And it was only that massacre that essentially shamed the international community, shamed them, to enter Bosnia 6 weeks later through a NATO bombing campaign and the extraordinary, brave, creative diplomatic efforts of Richard C. Holbrooke on the ground to achieve a ceasefire and then the peace agreement at Dayton by November 21st, 1995. We were shamed into acting in Bosnia because, frankly, the killing just became too outrageous. Too outrageous for us to stand by and do nothing any longer. And you have to wonder, if you look at these numbers in Syria, at least 130,000 people dead, 9.3 million refugees. Is it possible that the United States and Europe will stand by and allow Russia and China just to continue to block even humanitarian aid, much less a legitimate effort to stop that war through a ceasefire and force the Syrian government and the jihadi groups to stop their actions? And I think that Srebrenica moment may indeed come. I am not suggesting a NATO or US military invasion of Syria. I'm simply suggesting United Nations efforts to create humanitarian corridors on the Turkish-Syrian border, on the Jordanian-Syrian border, places where refugees can go to receive medical and food assistance, and places where international troops will protect them from the Syrian army and from the Syrian rebel groups. That's the very least that we can be done. So Syria turns into not just a political crisis for the Middle East, which it is, not just a geopolitical crisis for the region in case the war continues to spread into Lebanon, and if it continues to destabilize Iraq, and if it destabilizes the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and if it threatens the security of Israel, all that could happen. It's a profoundly moral crisis, in the way that Bosnia was a moral crisis for every human being, and certainly for the United Nations. So we need more active American leadership. And frankly, the kind of leadership that Holbrooke embodied, and I was a great admirer of him, that no problem is too difficult for countries to overcome if they have the will. And there is this quality sometimes, you read our op-eds, you listen to the talking heads on TV, it's just too hard. We can't be the world's policeman. We can't be everywhere. Well, when 9.3 million people are refugees and 130,000 people are dead, it's everyone's concern. And so that's a problem that the United States needs to turn and face. A third issue in the Middle East, beyond Egypt, beyond Syria, is Iran. And here I think the news is much better. I very much admire what President Obama has done to get things to their current state. The interim agreement, the discussions with the Iranian leadership, the first we've had in 34 years. It's a remarkable fact to me that during my generation, and I started in the State Department as an intern in 1980 in West Africa and Mauritania, I became formally a member of the service in 82, nobody in my generation ever went to Iran. I never met, in all of my diplomatic career, I was not allowed to meet an Iranian diplomat. When I was the Iran negotiator for President George W. Bush and Secretary Condi Rice, our policy was we would not meet them. And then when we finally offered negotiations with the Russians and Chinese and British, French, and Germans, the P5 countries did in 06 and 07, the Iranians turned us down. So for 34 years, since the Jimmy Carter administration, there was no strategic discussion between Tehran and Washington whatsoever. And now finally President Obama has us to the point where those discussions are taking place. And the interim agreement was achieved. The new negotiations for the final agreement have started. And I think what the Americans here can take some comfort in, we normally think we have a dysfunctional red-blue divide in Washington. There's a lot of bipartisan support for what the president is doing. His policy on Iran is remarkably similar to the policy that we created when I worked in the Bush administration. In fact, I think President Obama has strengthened it. He strengthened the sanctions. He made the threat of force real, but he also was willing to send his people to negotiate on a long-term basis. And I think diplomacy obviously is the route we ought to be taking with the Iranians now. Our first impulse has to be diplomacy, not the use of force. And we have to exhaust diplomacy before we even consider it. And I think an objective look at these negotiations, I'd be happy to talk about it with anybody, would indicate that there's a real chance for a deal. It's going to have to be a compromise, because you never go to the negotiating table and win 100-0. You never just defeat your adversary at the negotiating table. It's a process where you have to seek common ground. And I think we all know what the outlines of this deal are. I think there's a reasonable chance. Maybe the president said it was 50-50. Those aren't bad odds if you've not talked to someone in 30, 40 years. And if it can be reached at some point this year, either mid-year or at the end of 2014, it will be an historic agreement. And it requires the support of the Arab world. I've been disappointed by the reaction of the Saudi authorities publicly. There's been so much public criticism of President Obama from Saudi officials. I find it unseemly. I think too much criticism of the president by Israeli officials. And it's interesting to see Saudis and Israelis coming together to criticize the United States on a major Middle East issue. I've never seen that before, but we're seeing it now. We should not have a policy just of confrontation, which is what some of these critics from both Saudi Arabia and Israel want us to have. We've got to have a policy of seeking some kind of agreement first and only thinking of the use of military force last. What worries me about Iran is not just what happens at the negotiating table. It's what happens after. Because if an agreement can be reached, this agreement will be reached between the 6 countries, PPI plus 1 in Iran, it'll have to be brought back to capitals. I worry what might happen in Tehran. I think that there's every reason to believe that President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif are reformers. They're genuine. I know when they first were elected and they came into power, it was fashionable to question whether they're actually reformers. I think an objective look at them would say, yes, they certainly are. And they've gone so much further with us in the negotiations than I would have expected. But they've got to bring it back to the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. And they've got to bring it back to a government where the Revolutionary Guard Corps Command has significant influence. And if Rouhani and Zarif make some of these fundamental compromises and dismantlement of Iran's nuclear facilities, of the Arak heavy water reactor, to go from 19,000 centrifuges at their Iranian enrichment plants down to some significantly lower number, that's going to be tough, I think, for the right wing, the reactionary part of the Iranian government to accept. And I wonder if what President Rouhani negotiates can actually be backed up and will be backed up by the Supreme Leader. We have problems in our capital too, because if President Obama agrees to a deal with Iran, I would imagine that part of it would be to relieve Iran of some of the major killer sanctions that are in place. Some of them are executive actions taken by the president. Some are UN Security Council resolutions, Chapter 7, where the president has executive authority on behalf of the United States. But some of them are congressionally authorized sanctions. And you'd have to have acts of Congress. You'd have to have agreements by both houses of Congress to take them away in an election year. We're in one of those interminable electoral cycles in the United States. We're always in an election year in the United States, but this is a midterm election. This is 2014, where politics would, I think, enter into the vote on whether you relieve sanctions on Iran in an event of an agreement. And I worry about our capital, about Republicans and Democrats in the president's party. Some of the people leading the effort for new sanctions are Democrats, not just Republicans. So domestic politics in both countries will come into play. There's so much we can talk about, but I won't talk about now, and I want to get to your questions. But the fate of Iraq, and many, many more people dead in Iraq, just as this conference has been underway through suicide bombings in Baghdad and other places, as you read about. The fate of the Arab world. Will it be able to regain some of this movement and commitment to reform, to democratic rule, to market liberalization, and to authoritarianism? These are open questions. And the United States is on the margins. The people of the Arab world will write this history. But we can have an influence. And I think we need to have an active, assertive American involvement to support these reform efforts. That's essentially what I wanted to say to you this morning. A last point on Ukraine. I don't think we can leave here without at least discussing Ukraine. But I would say that what we're looking at here is the most profound international crisis of President Obama's 5 years in office, and certainly the most direct threat to European security since the day the Cold War ended, December 25th, 1991. That was the day the Soviet Union imploded, ceased to exist, and split into 15 new countries. Because what President Putin has done by putting Russian troops across the border of Ukraine into the Crimea, and now beginning to respond to appeals by ethnic Russians in Kharkiv, in Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine, for protection. He's violated the United Nations Charter. He's violated the Helsinki Final Act. He's violated the Budapest Agreement of December 1994, when the United States, Britain, and the Russian Federation vowed to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. President Putin has violated the most fundamental international laws. And he's done so in the most base and cynical way. And it's a real threat. Now, how does the United States respond? How does Europe respond? We're not going to use military force. We have no security commitment to Ukraine. We have a security commitment to 26 European countries in NATO, including neighboring Poland and neighboring Slovakia, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but no security commitment to Ukraine. It would be catastrophic. It would be irrational for the United States and Europe to use military force against President Putin. This would be a war among nuclear powers. It is unthinkable in the 21st century. And so you're going to see civilized forbearance on the part of Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, David Cameron, and most notably the leader of the NATO alliance, President Barack Obama. There will not be a military counterpunch to Putin's land grab in Crimea. But there is going to be, I hope, a major diplomatic pushback. And, there's no question Putin's on the offensive. He chose the territory and time to fight. And the West is on the defensive. But it's going to be a very long campaign. And I would think the more Putin seeks to use military force to get his way, the more unpopular he's going to be in Ukraine. 65% of the country, at least, are Ukrainian ethnic nationalists. And even among the Russian population in the south and eastern part of the country, considerable unhappiness that suddenly, without any provocation, really, military force is being used. I'm not sure that Putin can sustain this easily, just as the Soviets couldn't sustain their invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. I think you'd see this. You'd see economic sanctions, and the Congress will vote them against Russia, including Chapter 2 of the Magnitsky Law that Congress has already voted upon. You'll certainly see the European Union and the United States cease to do business as usual with the Russians. We were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty. I would think that would stop. The White House is already hinting, if you read the White House statement yesterday, that the President will not attend the G8 summit in Sochi that Putin was to have hosted, part of Russian soft power. I would think that all the other members of the G7 would follow suit. And it's time really probably to expel Russia from the G8. They were put there by President Clinton in 1994 because we wanted to reach out to President Yeltsin. But you can't have, in one of the primary economic fora of the world, a country that is abusing the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another country. And I think you'll see now the Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians have asked for a formal NATO meeting. Whether President Obama or Secretary Kerry goes, a major NATO meeting this week to reaffirm the Article 5 collective defense guarantee of the borders of all of our NATO allies, particularly those who came from the Warsaw Pact, and particularly the three countries that were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in May 1940 by the Red Army, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They're NATO allies. We are pledged to defend them. And those are the stakes. So this is a profound crisis. As I said, I think the most grave for President Obama, and what it requires in Europe is the same thing I think that we're looking for in the Middle East. Resolute, self-confident American leadership. So I leave you with those thoughts on this Sunday morning. Thanks very much for listening to me. And I'd be very happy now, we've got microphones in a few minutes, to take your questions, hear your point of view. if the students here don't want to ask questions, we can just do what we normally do at Fletcher or Kennedy School. We'll just call on people. Very good. Why don't you approach the microphone? And let us know your name and where you're from.
Okay. Good morning, sir. Thank you very much for your remarkable speech. My name is Hui Ruo. I'm from Peking University in China, and I'm now studying in Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel as an exchange student. So in Israel, I'm really witnessing how China and Israel is recovering friendship that was damaged due to the Cold War influence and also some other political and historical factors. And it works great. And those efforts were mostly taken in economic and technology area. So I hope this can be a good news to United States rather than a threat, because I believe that United States can also amend the relationship with Arabic world, Arabic countries through economic and technology cooperation. So I'd like to hear your comment on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your question. And the first thing I should say is congratulations for your studies. Hebrew University is a great university. I don't know if you're studying Hebrew or Arabic.
Both Hebrew and Arabic.
Both Hebrew and Arabic. It's very impressive. I don't speak Hebrew. I tried to learn Arabic. It's difficult. But I think, and we're going to get off into another subject here, but okay, you've raised it. I think the world's better off, much better off, with Chinese engagement with the rest of the world, whether it's student engagement, at Hebrew University, or whether it's just China being a more active member of the international community. So, given China's power in the world, given its leading second biggest economy, given the power of Chinese soft power, of Chinese civilization, we Americans cannot see the world in zero-sum terms when it comes to China. And the more China engages productively and positively with the rest of the world, the better. And so thank you for what you're doing. Congratulations for what you're doing. Now, I will say this, and this is not aimed at you because you don't work in the Chinese government, but it's aimed at, not aimed, it's just a hope that as President Xi Jinping continues to develop what looks to be a new chapter in Chinese foreign policy under his leadership, that China will use its influence, its considerable influence in the world, to help mediate some of the world's most difficult problems. And with the greatest respect, I don't see that happening in the Middle East. I see China protecting Syria, using its veto at every opportunity to protect the Syrian government, including, as I said, on the humanitarian issues. And I hope that China and Russia will work with Europe and the United States on the Iran nuclear negotiations. China's been part of it since the beginning of this group, the P5+1, since December '05. And I think what China does to push the Iranians behind the scenes towards an agreement will be very helpful. So I just wanted to, those are directed at your government, not at you. And thank you for what you're doing, and good luck with your studies. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Erwin Rosenberg. I'm the Jean Mayer University professor here, and I congratulate you on a well-deserved recognition, and thank you for being here. Last night, I think I heard correctly that Ambassador Ford was suggesting that there may be some other fora, formal fora, where some of these difficult issues may be addressed. If we're really in a blocked situation in the Security Council, you've already mentioned that NATO will start to have some discussions regarding the Crimea crisis, but there are maybe some other opportunities for groups that have some international influence to address the terrible situation in Syria if the Security Council is totally blocked by some of the votes that you mentioned. Are there other organizational frameworks where some of this can be addressed?
Thanks very much, and I'm so sorry I didn't hear Ambassador Ford, because he's such an impressive person. He knows this space better than anybody in our country, and I'm sorry he's left the U.S. government, but I certainly appreciate the reasons why he did. I want to put one point on the table, because someone asked me before I started speaking, and I was asked by some journalists this morning on an earlier conference call. I don't see the U.S. allowing President Putin to link the Ukraine crisis to Syria and the Middle East. And I was asked by a journalist this morning, you know, if in order to convince Putin to stop in the Crimea, would we be willing to see things his way in Syria? And the answer is no. You know, diplomats try to, and leaders try to link issues all the time. But since we're getting absolutely nothing from the Russians on Syria, why would we try to compromise with the Russians in any way, shape, or form on Syria in the hopes, the vain hopes, that maybe he wouldn't invade more of Crimea or eastern Ukraine? I don't see that happening. I think President Obama's got to play a tougher game with the Syrian government. Diplomacy's got to continue. Despite the fact we may want President Assad to go, those are President Obama's feelings. And despite the fact that we don't have diplomatic representation in Damascus, the only way to get to a ceasefire is to talk to Assad, as well as the rebel groups, as well as Iran, as well as the Russian government. So I think the United States has got to look for places to talk, and we can never give up on that. And the United Nations talks have been led by the most impressive, skillful person, Lakhdar Brahimi. I have enormous respect for him. And there isn't anybody better in the world who could be a mediator than Lakhdar Brahimi on something like this. But no one has helped him. None of the parties have helped him. So I'd say you've got to keep going with diplomacy. Even if it's backroom diplomacy, secret talks, because a ceasefire and an eventual end of the war has got to be the strategic aim. Last point to your very good question would be to say diplomacy sometimes cannot succeed unless it's backed up by power or the use of power. And in this case, with the greatest of respect, because I support President Obama, I think the opportunity he had in September, when he drew the red line on Syria chemical weapons, when Assad crossed it twice, in my view, we should have used air power against Assad's air force. It would have made the point that Assad's actions, he was being held accountable for his actions, and it would have inhibited the ability of his air force to strike at Syrian civilians, and we missed that opportunity. If you try to create humanitarian exclusion zones, if Turkey, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States work together on this, and those would be the countries that would work together on it, we would have to have air power in the region collectively to prevent the Syrian government from trying to fire on refugees in a humanitarian zone, and I think we ought to consider that. And if Syria says you're violating our territorial integrity by establishing humanitarian exclusion zones in our territory, the answer to that is, you've abused your people for 3 years. And 130,000 people are dead and 9 million are homeless. What rights do you have to object to the Turks and the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Americans getting together to support refugees? And I think our focus should be on the refugees. And we should do everything we can to make life better for them and give them a chance to survive this war. So it's a big question you've asked. My attempt to answer it. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Scott Warnbrock. My son goes to Tufts. I have a question. Last night, I, as a novice, sat through and heard about Syria in a way I've never heard about by our media or anyone else. Graphic descriptions of jihadist groups to make Al-Qaeda look moderate. Numerous groups, 5 or 6 by name. The gentleman was very good at detailing it. A reporter who talked about it was an inferno there. Syria's lost now, basically. The question I have is, in listening to Ambassador Ford talk, he said when he went to the Geneva Convention, discussion of terrorism was off the table, which I found kind of interesting from a complete negotiator. I can't imagine telling Israel, for example, terrorism of the West Bank's off the table before we talk about an issue there, or for us, for example, being told that. The question is basically, if there's that much terrorism and violence, talk about 3,000 people getting killed, if Assad leaves and creates this vacuum of power, what happens to the Alawites? What happens to the Christians? What happens into the north? Is there any group able to come in now and assume some kind of semblance of society? And what do we do about the terrorists? Do we handle it before? Do we handle it after? How does that all work in trying to bring us together?
Yeah, you've asked the right questions. I'm not sure anybody in the world has the answers to them. But if there's an American who knows this space 100 million times better than me, it's Robert Ford. So I listened to what he had to say last night. And I just made 2 quick points. It's true that among the most effective of the rebel fighting forces, there are jihadi groups that have conducted their own human rights violations against Syrian citizens, so we can't support them. But to say that just because they're there, we shouldn't do anything. There are still moderate rebel groups. We missed a big chance to support them 2-3 years ago. And I'm sorry we missed that chance. But it's still possible to give them financial aid, as the Emiratis, the Saudis, Turks are doing, give them military aid. The United States announced more than a year ago that we would do that, but we really haven't done it. We said we'd do it, but we haven't followed through. And if you completely absent yourself strategically, then you find yourself with very little influence. So there's an opportunity for us. But you paint the most compelling picture of why this is so difficult. And it's really complex. And the only thing I can think of is that I think the President and Secretary Kerry are right to seek a ceasefire and then a transitional government. Whenever the end comes from the Assad regime, it's going to be chaotic and it'll likely be violent. You have to try to protect civilians, and a transitional government where Kurds, Alawites, and especially Sunni, some of the Christian groups, have a right to participate in the government, that is a given. How you get there, no one has provided that roadmap. And so that's where the next great thought has to come, either intellectually from somebody here at Tufts, or at Harvard, or by some great person like Lakhdar Brahimi. I don't think he's going to give up Brahimi, and that gives me, at the age of 81 or 2, an extraordinary person. I think we've got to support him in trying to keep diplomacy alive towards a ceasefire and transitional government. Those are the two goals. Can't stop. Can't leave this civil war to its own devices, I think. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, so my name is Javier Torres. I'm an Ecuadorian student at Hampshire College. First, I wanted to thank you for your honesty while approaching all these topics. I know it must be really hard to approach them, but I really want to acknowledge your transparency with them. And that being said, I had a lot of questions, but I wanted to ask something related to my studies. A lot of the discussions on the Middle East and North Africa always revolve around the Arab world, the Arab problem, the Arab Spring. And I wanted to hear your stance on the idea of using Arab to describe this very diverse region, culturally and ethnically. There's a lot of nationalities, just as we heard from the last questions, and a lot of ethnicities. And I wanted to hear what your stance was, because I know it must be really hard to define a region on other terms than what has been the norm, but I wanted to hear what you had to say.
Thank you. It's a great question. I wish I were a Middle East scholar. I'm not. But I'll tell you one thing. You remember when this all started in Tunisia and Tunis, and then in Cairo more than 3 years ago? People couldn't agree in the Arab world what to call it, and people here were confused. So the American press started saying Arab Spring, and it quickly became not the right thing to call it, as spring turned into winter. I went to a conference in Britain, and mainly of Arabs, and some Americans and Europeans, and we actually had a poll. What do we call these transformative events? And there were lots of different suggestions. Some people still said Arab Spring. Other people said Arab uprisings, plural. Some people said, no, it's an uprising, singular, of all Arabs. It's not just individual countries. Other people said Arab revolutions, which I think is the title of my talk today, the revolutions. And then some people said, including Arabs, the Arab awakening. Now this refers to George Antonius's great book of 50 or 60 years ago, about the Arab awakening against the Ottoman Empire, the Arab awakening for Arab nationalism, for Arab independence against colonialism. Is this a second Arab awakening? So I'm not even sure. We're so much in the middle of this crisis in the Arab world, it's not clear what even to call it. There's no unanimity on what to call it by the Arabs themselves. And you're absolutely right to say that we can't just talk about this in singular terms. There's an Arab world. And Arabs talk about the Arab world. It's cultural, it's linguistic, it's political, united in historic terms by someone like Nasser back in the 1950s. But there's no one who speaks for it now. Not a single leader can speak for it now. And you're right that we have to look at all these countries individually. And I think that was actually one of the insights that President Obama had back 3 years ago. You cannot have an American policy towards the Arab world that is common. You have to actually establish policies towards the 22 different Arab countries, and they'll be unique. And that is one reason why we were so active through NATO, although I think the US could have done even more, to dislodge Gaddafi first to prevent the massacre at Benghazi of Gaddafi's armed column and then to kick him out. But we did really very little in Bahrain. It's because we developed these unique policies country by country. So you may not see the consistency there, but I think you're right. You have to perceive the complexity of this highly diverse part of the world, Arab world. That's my attempt to answer your outstandingly good question. Thank you. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I'm Michaela from the IDF delegation.
The IDF?
Yes.
Very good. From Israel.
Yes.
Good.
I was hoping to have your opinion on a thought that I had following the recent occurrences in Ukraine. That as you described in Bosnia, we have seen from Syria just too much. If it's the daily use of the barrel bombs or the use of chemical weapons that we've seen. Do you believe that perhaps the world now, with Russia, perhaps, as you said, going against international law, maybe would consider cancelling the veto that Russia had against the entering of the international community into Syria?
Thank you very much, Michaela. And I guess I'd say this, Russia holds a big card here. It's a permanent member of the council. It has the veto. And there's no getting around it. The other 4 members, permanent members, don't have the constitutional or legal powers, better way to put it, under the UN framework to deny Russia the use of that veto. You couldn't deny the US or France the right of the veto. So that's not an option. But, and I think I know in a lot of your courses here at the Fletcher School, as in our school, this question of intervention, when do you intervene? When does the international community intervene? When do we not? Is a really tough one. Because we've seen virtually success. The intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11 was a UN Security Council blessed and authorized mission by the US, UK, and eventually NATO. Eventually we had Security Council resolutions in Bosnia that allowed us to put European and NATO troops in to keep the peace in Bosnia after the Dayton Accords. And yet there have been other times, Kosovo, 4 years after Bosnia, where the Russians blocked a UN Security Council resolution that would have condemned Milosevic for the ethnic cleansing of Muslims. He tried to kill 1 million Muslims in Kosovo in the spring of 1999. The Russians vetoed the United Nations to help the Muslim citizens. So what did President Clinton do? In the NATO leadership, we said, we're going around the UN Security Council. If it won't act, we will. NATO used military power to stop Milosevic. I think what we probably have to do now in Syria is go around the Security Council and go around Russia and China. And if we're to establish humanitarian exclusion zones, including possibly even near the border of your country with Syria, then we're going to there'll have to be a coalition that comes together. The coalition will be led by Arab states, because the Arab states have been one of the few to try to do something. And they'll be assisted, I would hope, by my country. If President Obama is willing to go that far, I don't know if he will. So we'll have to ignore the Security Council. And that's just the way the world works. If cynical governments like Putin's use the veto cynically, then governments that are more democratic like ours need to go around the United Nations Security Council. It's not the place where all human problems can be resolved. We saw that in Kosovo, we're seeing it in Syria. And the Syrian people are the victims of that. So another great question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, friends. I'm a legal from the Los Angeles Times. I was a rambling member, I should say, of the panel yesterday. And I painted us a complete picture of what's going on in Syria. My main question centers around the word moderate rebels. This has been a pet peeve of mine, actually, in general, because it's changed from moderate rebels to somewhat more moderate rebels, etc. And you sort of compare it to the whack jobs that are in the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham and other places. My question for you is, there's been a lot of talk now about America, again, turning, I suppose, or pivoting towards the region again in terms of considering armed options, or I should say armed support for the rebel groups. The question is that the rebel groups have now really disintegrated completely. I mean, even the point man for the West, Saddam Idris, he was basically fired by the coalition a few days ago. Then he turned around and said, actually, guess what, I'm not fired, I'm still here. And in fact, he showed up in the video supported by many of the commanders who are in the southern front, in other words, apart with Jordan. And they were effectively saying, we're going to only work with Idris. So I guess my question for you is, now you have effectively two supreme military councils, and in other words, two, I guess, conduits for American support to come in. How do you intend to deal with that, for one? And more importantly, considering the fact that this is a Saudi Arabian-led effort in that particular area, and I mean, with all due respect to Saudi Arabia, I don't think America and Saudi Arabia's views of moderates are the same. What do you intend to do?
So, I know they're going to ask me to stand down from this podium very quickly because you got to go on to lunch.
Nick, you have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes? You've asked a question for which we could design an entire course at the Fletcher School, at the Kennedy School. I can only give you the briefest possible answer. 2 quick points. Number one, if you walked into the White House in 09, 10, 11, you would hear a variation of the following mantra about our strategic position. And Ryan Lizzo wrote about this in the New Yorker in 2010. The Obama people would say, we're over-invested in the Middle East and we're under-invested in Asia. And this led to the pivot, the assertion that Asia was strategically more vital. I think the events in Syria, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq have disproven that bumper sticker. I think the events in Ukraine have disproven that bumper sticker. I hope it doesn't sound arrogant if you're not an American for me to say this. I think it's objectively true. We're the most powerful country in the world. We are the key state in the international system. Professor John Eikenberry at Princeton says we're the system operator of the international system as it exists. If we think we can just pivot to one part of the world and not be centrally engaged in the Middle East and Europe, well, it just doesn't work that way. I think the administration is finding that out. That's point one. Point two, you're right. The word I use is grossly general and probably not very helpful, moderate. What does it mean? What do we mean when we say that? And I wish you'd ask this to Robert. He'd have a better answer than me. I think what we mean is, okay, so what did he say? Why am I answering this question? He's smarter than I am.
It's a hard one. I mean, you can't do the whiskey test. I mean, a friend of mine once said you give a guy a glass of whiskey and that's the test to see if they're moderate or not. Obviously, it's a ridiculous notion.
So, here's what I'd say. I'd say that there are Syrian leaders who are democratic in their orientation, and that's their aspiration for Syria, to be a democratic country, not either an Assad-type dictatorship or a jihadi dictatorship, number one. Number two, they're inclusive. They understand the diversity ethnically and religiously of the country, and they want to honor that, not destroy it. So rather it being a battle to the death, which is how the jihadi groups and Assad see it, the moderate leaders would say, no, we have to recreate Syria and honor and safeguard all the different parts of Syria. It's not unlike the unbelievable struggle that Iraq is under these days. And third, civilized, that they don't use their power against civilians. And some of the jihadi groups have done that.
Also the moderates too. I'm sorry, I shouldn't actually go back and forth. I took the chance
No,
to
it's
say that
okay.
as well. I mean, there's been widespread reporting of the fact that even the SMC, quote unquote, or the most so-called moderate groups have actually turned their weapons and committed horrific human rights violations among Alawite villages. I mean, I guess my greater point is that this is too hard to believe someone knows what's going on.
And again, and so my comparison to Bosnia, here's where my comparison breaks down. At least in the summer and autumn of 1995, we could look at President Izetbegovic, the Muslim leader. They were the victims of Serb aggression, and they were a coherent army and a coherent government, and we could lend our support to them. There is no such entity in Syria now. You're exactly right. And that weakens the international response, and it complicates it. You're exactly right. So thank you for pointing out how impossible this situation is. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lizzie Robinson, and I'm a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium. In your remarks, you mentioned that you thought Obama had done a good job balancing competing American interests and U.S. foreign policy. And you noted that Obama did eventually call for Mubarak to step down in Egypt. However, he did receive a lot of criticism for making that decision too late and for delaying that decision. And I think the protesters in Egypt were especially critical of that. Furthermore, some may argue that the delay of that decision eroded some of America's credibility as a defender of human rights in the world. So my question to you is, do you think in that specific instance, Obama waited too long to ask for Mubarak to step down?
Very good question. I do not agree with that. criticism of President Obama. I've never agreed with it. In fact, I was always mystified by it. Maybe because I've worked in governments. But when did the crowds begin to materialize in a consequential way in Tahrir Square? What day was it? January 21, 22, 23? Yeah. So as I remember, if somebody can challenge me on this, I mean, my dates might be off by a day or two. The president called Mubarak on around the 25th or 26th. And he had a series of private conversations before the president came out and said Mubarak must go tomorrow. Remember that? And I think the president went from beginning the conversation with President Mubarak to demanding publicly the resignation of President Mubarak. It was about a week. That is warp speed for a government. You can't expect a president to take 30 years of American policy. And for 30 years we supported President Mubarak, we supported President Sadat before him. And in 1 or 2 days, because crowds have materialized to say, we're changing our policy. And so you're right, the conventional wisdom in the press, on the blogs, on the talking heads on TV was, what's taking the president so long? I was stunned he worked so fast. And if you look at some of the memoirs that are coming out now and some of the articles from people who've left the Obama administration, there was a big disagreement about this. There were significant people at the cabinet level who thought he was going far too fast. You're going to ditch Mubarak on the basis of a couple of days of a protest? Really? What kind of influence will we have? And so this debate took place, and the president, I thought, acted very quickly. Never agreed with that criticism. It may be a function of the fact that we live in this internet age. You've got to have a public statement every 3 hours or else someone else characterizes your position as a government. And I've often thought it's interesting what the internet age has demanded of people in government is. The first question they have to ask, like when Putin sent his troops over the border Saturday, the first question now that we have to ask in every capital is, what do we say? Before the internet age, the first question any government would ask was, what do we do? And there's sometimes a conflict between those two questions. So you've asked a great question. I'm not trying to demean your question. I just have a very strong view that the conventional wisdom is wrong on this. And that we really ought to be asking the question, did President Obama get it right? With the benefit of hindsight, did we actually desert Hosni Mubarak too soon? Should we have carried on quiet, secret diplomacy with him in order to get him to make some compromises about how he treated people in Tahrir Square before we asked for his resignation? And I think sometimes quiet diplomacy makes sense. So I'll give you one more example, not to belabor this. Read the White House statement issued yesterday afternoon about President Obama's 90-minute phone call with President Putin. It's a very careful statement. It condemns the invasion, but it recognizes the rights of ethnic Russians. It recognizes the right of the Russian government to be concerned about the rights of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And it talks about the fact where the United States wants to form a group to discuss this and mediate it, and we'd help. There are a lot of olive branches in that public statement. I think what the president's probably trying to do is conduct, non-transparent, quiet, private talks with the Russian government. Is there a way out of this? Rather than just a war of press statements. And I think sometimes in government you need to give yourself the space and not respond to these CNN calls for immediate consequential statements. It's a really interesting question to think about. How do we practice diplomacy in the 21st century? So thank you for asking the question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Burns, my name is Sam Whitefield. I'm also a member of the EPIIC Colloquium this year. You said something very interesting when you were talking about Syria. You said that you thought the West had missed its opportunity. And what that made me think of was 1968 in Prague, and especially 1956 in Hungary, when I think it's very clear that the West missed an opportunity to do something positive. And so I wonder, especially considering that the Czech government yesterday compared the situation in Ukraine to the 1968 Prague Spring. Well, the tanks haven't rolled into Kiev yet, but they're rolling into Simferopol and they're rolling into Kharkiv. And so I wonder, how do we make sure that we don't miss this opportunity?
It's a great question. I would just suggest to you the factors that were present in Hungary in 56 and Prague in 68, the central factor was that Russia had nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union. And so I think President Eisenhower, who was not a weak person, and President Johnson, another strong person, felt that it would be, I'm interpreting this, irresponsible, potentially catastrophic for the United States to use military force to oppose the Soviet invasions of Budapest and Prague. And that's the calculation that President Obama is facing this weekend. It's the calculation that President Bush faced in August 2008 when Russia invaded sovereign Georgian territory, because Abkhazia and South Ossetia are sovereign Georgian territory. We did not use military force in any of those instances for one simple reason. It would be historically, catastrophically irresponsible to put ourselves in a position where nuclear war was possible. And the nuclear genie, President Kennedy used to say, he said memorably, it hangs like a sword of Damocles over our head. It's so powerful that we cannot take the chance. And that's why you won't see NATO with a military response in Crimea or in eastern Ukraine. We're going to play a different game. It'll be a long-term diplomatic, economic sanction strategy to isolate Putin and to dishonor Putin. But it won't be the use of force. And I think President Eisenhower and President Johnson made the right decisions not to use military force. They could have started a nuclear war. One last point, when read Graham Allison's book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Essence of Decision, is the best book ever written 45 years ago, I think. There's a point in the Cuban Missile Crisis when President Kennedy asked, if I do what you want me to do, and some of his generals and diplomats were saying, go to the hilt and threaten war, how many people died? And nobody could answer the question. But in October 1962, a rough guess might be well over 100 million people would have died between the Ural Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. And so I think President Obama is right not to put military force on the table. Now, he will be criticized. You can see it coming from his right. He's weak, he's vacillating, he's not standing up. What is he supposed to do? Get us into a nuclear conflict with Putin? No, we're going to play a smarter game. And in the end, Putin's going to lose. You cross someone's border with military force in the 21st century, you pay. The United States of America found that out in the Iraq War. So we learn from our experience. We fight him in a different way, smarter way, I think. Great question, though. And thanks for recalling the history. Are we out of time? Do we have...
No, Nick. Can I say a few words?
Yes, please.
It depends on you. I mean, our friendship is...
I just don't want to deny people their lunch. Maybe we need shorter answers from me. Should we try to maybe deal with these 4 questions, and I'll be brief.
Here's the issue. We've lost several panelists, one from each panel that follows the lunch. We've also lost the military academies who had to drive home early because of the snow. The good side of this is everybody in this auditorium is welcome for lunch. So, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of time. So we can go into the 12:30 time if you can't go that time. All right, 12:30. That's 12:30.
10 more minutes. Okay. 4 questions, 10 minutes. We can do it. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lainey Stecker. I'm a senior at Tufts and a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium. I'm wondering whether in your diplomatic career you were ever asked to support policies that conflicted with or challenged your personal morals, and more generally, what is the role of morality in the United States foreign policy?
Well, there's a question that Jean Mayer would have answered better than me, the great Tufts president. I think it's very important for anybody in public service to, when you go into public service and you work for any administration, to ahead of time say to yourself, there's certain things I'm not going to do for the government. And that was advice that I got when I became a diplomat by diplomats. Where is your line? What are you willing to do and not willing to do? And that's in a democratic society. We're all Democrats, small d. That's important. So no, there was never a time in my career where I felt I faced a personal, moral, ethical dilemma. I was opposed to the policies of President Clinton or President Bush or President Carter, so that I needed to resign. But I hope that if I had faced that point, I would have. But you never know, it's a hard thing. There's this great European tradition that people do resign. We don't honor that as much in the United States, but there's a friend of mine named Brady Keysley, who was a Foreign Service officer. He worked with me in Athens when I was ambassador there. He resigned in opposition to the Iraq War in 2003. He was criticized by a lot of people inside the government. I never criticized him. I didn't agree with him, but I honored his right to disagree and to take a very dramatic step. He ended his career out of a moral opposition. I think we should honor that. I think in public service, if you serve at any level of government, state, local, or federal, international, there are always going to be times when you disagree with your boss. And I used to look at it this way. If I had a chance to walk into the Secretary of State's office or the ambassador's office when I was younger and just say respectfully, sir or madam, in the case of our Secretaries of State, I disagree with what we're about to do. Here are the reasons. And I felt if I had that opportunity, that was usually good enough for me. Sometimes they'd agree and sometimes they'd disagree. And the hard thing to do in public service is when you lose the fight internally and then you have to go out publicly and support it, that's the price of public service. It's a good price to pay. So it's a great question. Thank you. Yes?
Hello, Mr. Burns. My name is Alexandra Zuba. I'm here with the Russian student delegation.
Very good. So you're from the Russian Federation?
I am from the Russian Federation, and your speech was very interesting to me. Respectfully.
Interesting in the Chinese definition of that word.
Yes. I decided to go onto the UN official site and just recheck a few of the facts. So respectfully, if you'll let me read out a very small expert, that on the 22nd of February, the Security Council of the United Nations unanimously adopted a resolution for bringing humanitarian aid into Syria, and China and Russia were both actually part of that unanimous decision. And Russia had previously and at the time stated that we only had concerns for, in terms of the United Nations, that there would be military intervention as soon as that was worded, that the UN would only bring humanitarian aid. Russia and China both adopted this resolution. And as you have said, there was a little bit of a discrepancy in your speech. At first you're saying that President Obama is trying to create a diplomatic solution, reaching out to President Putin. At the same time, you're trying to say that you're trying to dishonor the President Putin, which is absolutely, this is whatever the US wants to do, they will do anyways. But my question to you is, in regards to Syria, do you think that the Crimea problem will stop the United States from cooperating with Russia and China on bringing humanitarian aid?
Thank you very much, and thanks for being here. How many Russian students are here?
10 people.
That's great. So you're all studying in Russia, you came to this conference?
Yes.
That's terrific. And thank you for your questions. Here's my answer to your question. You're absolutely right. Russia and China voted 10 days ago for a Security Council resolution that would call on the parties to allow humanitarian aid into the besieged cities like Homs and Aleppo. Here's the problem with that resolution. It was so watered down at the insistence of the Russian and Chinese governments that it's absolutely toothless and meaningless. It was the most cynical vote at the United Nations that I can remember in a long, long time. That resolution will not provide the kind of assistance that those refugees need. That's all there is to it. Point number two, my words, not President Obama's words. Don't blame him, blame me. That we should dishonor President Putin. I just think President Putin has made a great strategic mistake here. In the 21st, it's a very complex situation in Ukraine. There was no threat to the Russian ethnic populations in Kharkiv and Donetsk and Crimea. It was manufactured by the Russian government over the last 3 days. What he could have done, Putin could have called up the new leaders of Kiev, or could have sent Foreign Minister Lavrov to Kiev, or asked them to come to Moscow, or meet at Rostov-on-Don, or someplace in between, and said, let's talk about Russian concerns over the ethnic Russians. Absolutely legitimate if Putin had done that. If he had led with diplomacy, I think the world would understand it. In fact, I think the Ukrainian government, the new one, made a big mistake the first day they're in power, after Yanukovych left. They took a measure that the Russian language will no longer be honored in the eastern part of Ukraine. That was a big mistake. The ethnic Russians have a right to speak their language, they have a right to have it enshrined in their legislative bodies, and they have a right to have it in the schools. I think the advice to the new government in Kiev in part should be you need to work with the ethnic Russians, make them feel part of Ukraine. If Putin had launched a diplomatic campaign along those lines, I think people would have been sympathetic to him. But when you put tanks and special forces and helicopter gunships into the sovereign territory of another country without a UN Security Council resolution, and by the way, we can quibble or argue about March 2003 Iraq, but there were 16 UN Security Council resolutions that backed up the Western efforts against Saddam Hussein, Putin doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. So we will choose to fight through diplomatic means, peaceful means. I think this is a great mistake. Putin's going to lose in the end, and it's going to hurt the Russian Federation, but we can have a longer conversation about that. And thank you for being here.
Continue later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi, my name is Jenna. I'm a freshman in the EPIIC Colloquium here. First, I'd like to thank you for being here. I really enjoyed hearing you speak. I was hoping that you could briefly touch on something that you didn't really mention in your speech, which was the U.S. economic engagement in the region. We talked a lot about in class how economic issues and depression are kind of a cause of, first of all, the Arab Spring and a lot of the instability in the region. And we also discussed how some of the State Department's economic programs are relatively underfunded. So I was just wondering if you had thoughts on what the U.S. policy should be in terms of that kind of diplomacy.
Yeah, I think in a situation like this, like Egypt with an imploding economy with a lot of violence in Cairo, Alexandria, Sinai, it's difficult to get the private sector to invest, despite the best efforts. So we're really looking at structural assistance from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that all of us around the world can support, and then bilateral economic aid. In the case of Egypt, in the case of Syria, it's a humanitarian question. Can you get enough money together? And the Syrians need billions of dollars of assistance just to keep people alive. And so that's the imperative there. So I think it really depends on which country we're talking about. But you're right, without that kind of economic fuel, some of these countries will be in very, very tough shape. So this is a responsibility not just for the U.S., it's a responsibility for the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the wealthy countries of the Gulf, to help support the economic needs of these besieged populations. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I'm Ethan. I'm also a member of the EPIIC Colloquium, and thank you for speaking and for your service. My question is, and I think this person was really just lucky, I don't give her credit for this, but Sarah Palin in an article recently.
You mean a great foreign policy Russia expert.
Exactly. I think she was very lucky in this specific moment, but she, during the 2008 presidential campaign, she criticized Obama for not acting or for failure of action when Russia invaded Georgia. Do you think, and then now this situation with Ukraine, she's blaming that it wouldn't have happened if Obama had a tougher stance against Russia back then. Do you think that there's any merit to what she's saying, despite the person that said it?
Yes. I don't think there's any merit to that charge. As I said, President Bush was faced with a nearly identical situation in August 2008 in Georgia that President Obama is faced with now. And it would be suicidal, grossly irresponsible to create a conventional war in Europe between these two strong countries, Russia and the United States, over a disagreement over a third country. The nuclear genie changes everything about power. If we didn't have nuclear weapons or chemical and biological in the world, you'd still have to make a big decision. Do you launch massive armies against each other? That's what happened in 1914. A little event in Sarajevo, distant, dusty part of the empire, led to 16 million people being killed. So I think President Bush made the right decision in August 2008. I think President Obama's making the right decision now. Let's try to talk the Russians out of this, but not fight them. Be interesting, I don't know, just to end it on this, is there one of the Russian students who wants to speak to this? I'd like to give you the floor. And is there a way that we could work out, that you could think of, between Russia, Germany, the United States, a peaceful end to this war? Is there a way for President Putin to pull his troops back? But how do Russians see this?
Officially, in the Russian media, there is no information regarding Russian troops actually coming into the Ukraine, apart from the troops that were already there, because we had a Russian naval station in the Crimea, and
right.
Of course we have the right to keep our troops there,
yes,
where they're stationed. So at the moment, I think we're pretty open to diplomatic relations. There has been no insurgency, no intervention yet.
Yeah. And what makes this complicated, you're right that Russia has a lease until 2046 in Sevastopol at the Black Sea Naval Base. You have a right to be there. The question, I think, between President Obama it's interesting. The Kremlin issued a statement on the conversation, and the White House issued a statement. They were very different statements, but if you look at them both, there was a discussion between the two presidents yesterday about the following issue. If the primary issue is the Russian Federation's wish to protect the ethnic Russians in the south and east of the country, and that is an understandable issue if you're Russian, then how is that accomplished? And I think the point that President Putin made, I read the Kremlin English statement, they translated it, was, I reserve the right to use the military to protect ethnic Russians. President Putin. President Obama said in his statement, but there's another way to accomplish that. Why don't we invoke the United Nations, the OSCE, why don't we have seek our support to protect the rights of ethnic Russians, but don't use military force. So there's the dividing line, I think, on this question of Ukraine.
Well, I think you're quite right, and there's actually a UN meeting with Russia scheduled on the question. What the President Putin did, which raised a lot of questions in the US and the Western media, was he requested, as the head of the military in Russia, he requested the right, if something happened, if there were conflicts on ethnic basis, to use the military in Crimea. He's not planning to use it unless there is actual conflict, unless there are attacks on the Russian speakers.
Well, I want to thank you for speaking up. It's not easy, I'm sure, to do that, but I want to thank the Russian
It's my
students.
job to be here.
And I want to thank the Russian students for being here, and may we have a peaceful end to this crisis in Ukraine.
We hope for that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
First of all, Nick, thank you for your friendship. You are at the Institute for Global Leadership, and if you look at one of the 20-some-odd programs on our website, you will see a program called Access. And what it is a relationship between Beyond Conflict, previously the Project on Justice in Times of Transition, which Nick is deeply engaged in, and ourselves, which allow our students to interact with remarkable people such as Nick as diplomats to begin to think about what public service means. So that's another point of view. Nick has foolishly agreed to be deeply engaged in next year. When our theme is Russia. My God, what a segue. First, Dina, are you? Yeah. And your colleague's name is? Alexandra, thank you, and to Vladimir and to all you guys. We met yesterday. First of all, let me acknowledge the presence of Pat Nicholas from the Carnegie Corporation. Pat, where are you? Thanks to Carnegie. You're witnessing. And the bottom line here is that there are international delegations here from China, from Brazil, from Israel, Palestine, from Iraqi Kurdistan, from South Korea, Singapore, I'm sure I'm sadly missing somebody, Brazil, and it's an international confabulation here, I think that's a word. In any case, and it's a consortium that you've entered into, so I want to welcome, is Sohail Hashmi here? Is Sohail? No? So a delegation has come from the 5 colleges, from Amherst, Smith, Hampshire, etc., etc. It's a real eclectic thing. We're going to welcome you back next year for Russia. It's just a difficult moment in international diplomacy, and last night was very tough. This is a very tough issue that we're facing here. The word complexity seems to come up continually. We've asked our students to embrace complexity, embrace ambiguity, and to think about how to be still optimistic. And I think you're going to have a remarkable keynote at 3 o'clock with Inger Anderson, the Vice President of the World Bank, who's just come from Saudi and Tunisia with some really interesting positive news. So we're going to end, we hope, not with a whimper, but with a sensibility of how to look over the horizon. Everybody's invited to lunch because we lost the cadets, etc., etc., and let's go eat and be renewed. Okay, but to Nick Burns, thank you one more time.